Foundation. This is a verse that we like to use kind of as a theme verse, and it's probably familiar to you, but maybe you haven't thought about the implications in this verse, because it really is saying that a steward must be faithful, right? That's the emphasis of the verse. And we like to think that Stewards Foundation as an entity is faithful in what the Lord has given us to do. We hope that's true. That's our goal, our motivation. Stewards Foundation really was, I guess you could say, the brainchild of a man by the name of William McCartney. He lived in the Chicago area, and he actually began Letters of Interest in 1935. I don't know if you know that. And then later he started Christian Missions Press down in the South. So he was instrumental in 3 organizations being started that had a great impact on the assemblies over the years. He was a salesman, a furniture salesman, and then he had his own company, or he was a partner in a furniture company. But he was in fellowship in an assembly in the Chicago area, and that particular assembly decided that they had, their facility was too small, so they needed to build a new building, a new facility. And so they decided that they would get together and discuss how to finance that new facility. And as they discussed it, they decided there were 2 ways they would do that. They would first of all accept gifts, and second of all, they would offer interest-bearing notes to those that wanted to invest in that project. Well, Mr. McCartney, being a businessman, said, "Why aren't we going to the bank?" And somebody said, "Well, the bank really doesn't like small, non-denominational, independent groups like us, because if there's a failure, who do you grab? Who do you get a hold of to repay that loan?" So being an intelligent man, he reasoned, well, this is probably not a good investment for me either if the bank doesn't want to invest in it. So he made a donation, and then he invested his money in the bank. Now, I tell people, I don't know what era this took place, but I'm guessing it was around the crash back in the late 20s, the Depression, because the bank failed and he lost all his money that he invested. But what he noticed was everyone who invested in that project, the new construction of the assembly structure, got their money back plus interest. Faithful stewardship, you see. And so I think this is probably the seed thought for Stewards Foundation. And he realized not only was there a need, but there was also a supply somewhere. There were people that were willing to invest in the Lord's work. So he incorporated Stewards Foundation along with 4 other men in March of 1945. So we just turned 74 years old. Not me. I'm looking at it. Stewards Foundation, 74 years old now. And the purpose of Stewards Foundation can be found going back to those original articles of incorporation. And you see it in front of you here. It's to serve. It's to serve New Testament pattern assemblies. And it's to serve them in a way that they might not be able to do something on their own. Construct a building, finance a building, a project. Well, then there's also the idea of membership that comes with being a part of Stewards Foundation. That comes out of the articles as well. So who do we serve? Well, we serve those who are located in the United States. We serve those who are gathered in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ alone. And we serve those who operate, who function based on biblical principles. Seems pretty simple, but sometimes it gets a little complicated because the idea of membership is not something we care to talk about too much. But the reality is, our desire is to serve those who follow these principles. So if there are elders in the audience this morning, and you receive our documents annually, if you're a member assembly, and we say, would you sign these? The reason we do that is to make sure that we have an ongoing relationship with assemblies that agree in these areas, okay? We're not trying to dictate anything. You don't have to agree with those things. You don't have to be a member assembly. That's okay. But if you do want to be a member assembly, if you do want to avail yourself of our services, you'll have to sign the documents. Membership in Stewards Foundation? Well, as I said, we're 74 years old now. I guess it's a little difficult to see the pictures around the graphic in the center, but this is actually a construction project down in North Carolina, and you can see on the bottom left side, there's a foundation that's been poured there. And then you can see the progress of the building all the way to the conclusion of it, the completion of it, on the bottom right side. We loan money for buildings, and you hope that the buildings have good foundations under them, right? That's where you start. When I was in architectural practice, I said, the first thing we're gonna do is make sure you have a good foundation. Second thing we're gonna do is make sure your building's watertight. The rest of it's just lipstick. You know, you're just making it pretty after that. But you won't be happy if the foundation fails or if it leaks, right? Well, while we're loaning money for foundations, we think we're also involved in a small way in spiritual foundations that are being established in these facilities, in these buildings that are being erected. And ultimately, that's what our desire is. And that's the desire that Mr. McCartney had, is to see New Testament pattern assemblies established across the United States. Testimonies raised up, testimonies expanded, just like here. I made a comment to George. I said, you guys are frequent flyers. And I think there was a comment about, do we get miles? Well, we love frequent flyers. And somebody has asked more than once, can't you saturate your market? Well, maybe, but you know, a lot of assemblies come back to us for an expansion. If the work's growing, the testimony's building, they'll come back to us for another loan. And so, in that sense, maybe we don't ever saturate our market, we hope not. But the reality is, as I say, we're really interested in building not just concrete foundations, that's important, but seeing spiritual foundations raised up. Loans, well, 1945, the first year we loaned out $11,735. I don't know, Rob probably could figure that out, what that is in today's dollars. A lot more than 11,000. So we started slow, but in the next 20 years, we loaned out $10 million, $10.5 million. And then between 99 and 2018, another 21 million. So the reality is, at this point, I've got 76 million, we've loaned out, I'm sure, over 80 million. And the reason for that is there's 7 years I can't account for the loans. I can't find the records. So in our history, 74 years, over $80 million have been loaned out to assemblies across the United States. This doesn't include Canada, by the way, because at one point there was Stewards Foundation in the U.S. and then in Canada. So a lot of money over those years. Our current loan portfolio stands at $11.7 million. That's for about 50 different assemblies across the United States. So somebody would say, maybe like they did in that meeting with Mr. McCartney's assembly, why would we go to Stewards Foundation? Why not just go to the bank? Well, let me give you a few reasons why you should talk to us. You still may find the bank is better, by the way, but you should talk to us. First of all, we never require a personal guarantee for a loan. In fact, we won't allow that, because that puts somebody in that assembly personally responsible for that loan. And you realize if that person leaves, that responsibility follows you. If that person dies, it follows their estate. We don't want personal guarantees. The bank will often want a personal guarantee. They want to know who your 5 to 10 largest donors are, and they'll want their tax returns and their personal financial records, because they want them to personally guarantee that loan for that church group. We don't do that. Prepayment penalties. You can pay your loan off at any time. There's no penalty. You realize that the bank's in business for a profit, and we don't begrudge them of that, but the profit comes through the interest. So if you pay your loan off early, guess what they don't get? All of the interest, right? Well, we realize that, and we realize that most people that come to us for a loan would rather not come for a loan. I say we're a little bit like the dentist. Nobody wants to go to one. But if you have to go to one, you should know where there's a good one. Okay? So no prepayment penalties. Late penalties. We have no late penalties. And from time to time, assemblies go through a struggle financially, so we work with them. We try and work with them to make sure that we're not an undue burden on them. Now, the other side of that is we won't loan you the money if we don't think you can repay it. We'll just say no. Fees. You know, if you've ever borrowed money, you know the bank has all kinds of fees that they'll charge. We had no fees, zero. So you could send an application in to us weekly without fees. Now, I'm saying that with Nancy and Cynthia sitting in the audience. They would look at me sideways and say, stop that. But there are no fees associated with loans. Two things the assembly will pay for. The legal fees, which don't come to us, they go to our attorney, and a title policy. Okay? You'll pay for those two things. But we are competitive. The one thing you have to do is get it in writing from the bank. Don't just tell me the bank said this. Well, the bank will say anything. Okay? Get it in writing and bring it to us. We're competitive. We think we're more than just a lender. And part of the reason for that is because I come from the world of architecture, 24 years of practice. And so I can help you avoid a lot of issues that you might run across. And that happens more frequently than you can imagine. I was just talking with one of the brothers here today, assembling this area, contractor didn't get a permit. You know, those things happen, but you need to be aware of those things. It doesn't cost you a thing. It doesn't matter if you're borrowing money from us or not. You can call and ask questions. You can send us your contract. We'll look at your contract for land purchase, for a building purchase, a contract with an architect or an engineer. Let us review the contract and see if somebody's trying to snooker you. And let us keep you from making that mistake. We're available to help you with that. We're available to help through the process of construction with questions you may have. I won't go into all the details of things that have happened, but trust me, things have happened where we've caught something, contractor trying to get away with something, and help the assembly avoid that. We're here to serve you, and we're happy to do that, irrespective of loan. So take advantage of that experience. Now, many of you will know that we send out checks every year. Just this past January, I signed checks for $215,000. That didn't go into my pocket. But we sent those checks to assemblies that have commended workers that receive a gift every year from HCAP, the Healthcare Assistance Program. So you may be aware of that, but you may not know where it started. Well, it started with hospitals. Way back in the day when Mr. McCartney was still active, he was someone who was an entrepreneur and an investor. He had a realtor that would come to him with opportunities to invest in property. And he came to him one day and he said, how would you like to buy a hospital? Well, that's kind of an odd thing to suggest, but he was always looking for a way to propagate the gospel and to help the Lord's people. And so he thought about it. He said, you know, if somebody goes to the hospital, they probably have a physical need, right? But good chance they have a spiritual need too. So if we owned the hospital, we could put a chaplain in that hospital. And so everybody that comes through the door that needs something physically, they're going to hear the gospel. And that happened. And I wish there was some way I knew how many people were saved through that work. I don't know. You can read snippets here and there about how that worked and how people came in and how they heard the gospel. Bought the first hospital in Chicago in 1953, and for some reason, the folks out in Auburn, Washington, heard about that, and they said, come out and buy our hospital. These are community hospitals. These are not large facilities. But they'd taken Belmont, and they'd done such a great job of renovating it and restaffing it that the folks in Auburn said, buy our hospital. So they did. And it just kept going until they owned and or controlled 6 hospitals in the United States. 4 out in the Seattle area, 2 in the Chicago area. The one on the left here is Bethesda Hospital. You can see it was bought in 56, and then down below was a remodel. Often they would take these hospitals and add to them, add beds to them. And the ones on the right, I think the one at the top is Maynard, and the one at the bottom is Riverton, out in the Seattle area. Well, the hospitals were sold in 1982, except Maynard was sold in '70. And of course, after they sold the hospitals, the question is, what do we do now? Because they were helping commended workers with their health care through the hospitals. You could go to the hospital and you could get free or reduced cost medical care. And some took advantage of it. You had to get to Chicago or you had to get to Seattle for it. Some took advantage of it. But when they sold them, the question was, what do we do for commended workers now? And there was a little time of transition, but ultimately they decided, you know what? We're going to start paying for the bills of the commended workers, the medical bills. And they did that. And it almost broke them because it was so much money they were giving out, paying for those bills, millions of dollars each year. And if you know anything about the cost of health care, you'll know that in the late 80s and the early 90s when it really began to spike. So they decided that in the mid-90s, they said, you know, the board said, we can't keep paying for all the bills. So we're going to convert this program into a gift program, HCAP, Healthcare Assistance Program. Well, the total healthcare giving between 89 and 2019 is almost $25 million that we've given away. More recently, it's not in addition to, but more recently, with the gift program, it's a little over $15 million that has been given. So what comes in through the loans is going out in order to serve the Lord's people through an HCAP gift. And we like doing that, by the way. And we like to continue to do that. So when Stewards Foundation began, it was begun through investments. Remember I told you that the investments there at Mr. McCartney's assembly were repaid with interest. And so his vision for Stewards Foundation was really that it would be like a conduit or a channel for funds to flow through from those that had the money to those that had the need. And the way he would do that is to sell notes. So if you're willing to invest $100 and you wanted to have access to that money if you needed it, then you'd get a 4% return. That was a demand note. If, on the other hand, you were willing to leave it for 5 years, you'd get 5%. And later they extended that period of time. So over the years, they built a fund for loans through investments. Well, we found out in 2013 that laws change, and it's kind of hard to keep up with all those laws. And we found out in 2013 that instead of us worrying about the federal SEC, we need to worry about state SECs, the Securities and Exchange Commission in each state. And that was difficult to do. And so if any of you had a demand note back in 2013, you know that we sent you a check to close out that program. So I have people today come to me and say, how can we invest in Stewards Foundation? Well, I don't really have an investment vehicle like we once had because that program is closed. But what we do have is the opportunity for you to invest through planned giving. And if you want to do that, then we'll be glad to talk to you about it. Ultimately, we're going to point you over to Mr. Sullivan at BSS because they're happy to be the guys that do that work behind the scenes for an annuity, any kind of a planned giving vehicle. There's a return to you. There's a tax advantage to you if you want to invest in Stewards Foundation. But today, that's probably the best way to do. Other than gifts, we accept gifts. We don't solicit them, but we accept them. Finally, we have a lot of information on our website. Loan applications, information about the loans, how the loans work. There's a lot of information there. So if you have an interest in Stewards Foundation other than just talking with us, and feel free to call anytime. I have people call and say, I'm so sorry to take up your time. That's what I do. So don't feel badly about that. But if you want to see what we do, just get some information on it, then go to our website. And you'll find a lot of information there. I found this verse at the end of some of our financial reports many years ago, and I thought, what a great verse for Stewards Foundation. Because we can almost break our arms patting ourselves on the back, thinking we've done a great job, but the reality is it's the Lord that's been doing the work. It's the Lord that should receive the honor and the glory for anything that's been good at Stewards Foundation over these 74 years. So we want to give him the credit for this. That's Stewards Foundation.